day in and day out, parents are bringing these things into their house, their kids are eating them, the kids start getting caught up. And what happens is that once your chemistry becomes imbalanced, you end up in a recurring cycle that you can't get out of it. It's like a hamster running on a little wheel, and you keep going and going and going because you're not be able to break that pattern or that metabolism. You're not able to change the metabolism. That's why when I tell some patients, they come in and they go, oh, I have to have sugar every day, doctor. And I said, you know what, you're going to walk by a candy dish one day and you're not even going to look at it because you're not even going to crave it. And they look at me like I'm absolutely crazy. And you know what? I can tell you I cannot count on both hands, or literally dozens and dozens of patients come back and said, you're exactly right, I no longer have those sugar cravings. But if you don't fix the chemistry on a cellular level, you're never going to get rid of the cravings, and they're never going to be able to get away from the junk food.
Of course, companies in America produce products people want to buy. And I think that it would be wrong to depict corporations that make cookies as the bad guy. I mean, the fact is that somebody who eats too many sweets, they're putting too many cookies in their mouth and chewing them and swallowing them. So it isn't like anybody forced them to do that. I mean, the companies manufacture things that we want to eat, and people like sweets. I mean, that's kind of a basic thing. But I guess the problem in America today is like we're kind of a nation of excess in a lot of ways. You know, excess number of cars, excess amount of money, excess size of homes. I mean, you name it, we're excess. And we've kind of played this food thing in terms of junk food and sugars to excess.
Well, absolutely, you know, and you have to realize that excess is not always good, and we have to have variety in our foods. The problem is that most people, when they track their diets and bring them into my clinic, most people I look at and I see a lot of them are eating the same thing. A lot of them have more carbohydrates in their breakfast than they need for the whole day. And we have to realize they break down into sugars, and that can turn into fat if they're not utilizing it as energy. So that is a major problem. And you know the American motto is, if a little good, excess is great, isn't it?
And you want the super size too.
Of course, the 64-ounce pop that comes with it, which is another probably 20 teaspoons of sugar.
And bigger meals, bigger bags of cookies, or whatever it is that you're to treat. I don't mean to be down on cookies, by the way. I'm a cookie proponent actually at heart, but a closet at this point. But I think that what you mentioned a situation where somebody eats sugar and then like 2 hours later they're out eating another snack, and that's really what it takes to keep them comfortable. This starts to get into what the symptoms are of insulin resistance early on, not diabetes, moving towards metabolic disorder or syndrome.
Correct.
Insulin resistance, blood sugar levels climbing, a body's ability to break down sugar is starting to be impaired. What are the symptoms of early on insulin resistance?
Well, number one is going to be their inability to lose weight. Of course, they're putting more weight on. And the other big one is the sugar cravings. They end up in a vicious cycle. Here's what happens. When people eat sugar, there's going to be a spike in the blood sugar. Insulin's job is to bring that blood sugar level down by taking it, binding to it, and trying to get it into the cell. And what happens is that when that process becomes defective or not as optimal as it should be, then the glucose, we have to realize that insulin is a fat storage hormone. And if it can't get it into the cell to utilize for energy, so that's another complaint people are going to have, is lack of energy, because you can't get the glucose into the cell for energy. So what happens if you don't get it in for energy and you're not exercising at that point in time when you're eating a meal, which most people aren't, then or an hour after, and then what happens is that glucose that can't get into the cell actually goes into the fat garage. I call it the fat garage, but it's fat tissue. But it's an attached garage that goes right around your belly here, and most people don't want to have that.
Your own private pair.
Your own
love handles. There's various terminologies.
That's for sure.
So again, the symptoms might be lethargy a little bit. Somebody's a little lethargic.
Yeah, food cravings, inability to lose weight.
Gaining weight.
Yeah.
Gaining weight.
And you know, and insulin resistance has been a contributing factor to diabetes, sleep apnea, and all these other different types of problems.
Doctor, what is the connection between insulin and obesity?
Well, we have to realize, if you understand the physiology and the chemistry of how glucose is metabolized in the body, that if we don't utilize that as instant energy, it ends up going into the fat storage. And we have to realize that insulin also affects a hormone called leptin. And leptin is a hormone that actually helps us burn fat. And so when that step is altered, then our body actually starts storing more fat, and we actually don't start burning the fat. So you can see it's like one thing leads to another, and pretty soon you start progressing. Now you have all these other array of symptoms, but that's insulin's role in obesity.
What is the difference between childhood onset diabetes and adult onset diabetes? Two different types.
Yeah, well, they are two different types. Let's start with type 1, that's child or juvenile diabetes. Basically, the pancreas actually quit secreting the insulin. And
completely?
Completely, yeah. They don't know if it's viral or anything like that. But, you know, most of the times that's going to need to be handled with patients being put on insulin. Now, with type 2 diabetes, what used to be called adult onset diabetes, we don't call it that anymore because we have 12-year-olds who are diabetics. And so they no longer like to use the word adult onset because you can see it takes a little bit of time for that to occur. Now it's happening in 12-year-olds. Why? Because the way they're eating when they're young kids, when they're babies. I mean, I see people at the airport and they're sticking pop in the little juice things for their babies. Come on, let's get a grip out there. You can't bring these kids up this way and think that their physiology and chemistry is going to work the same way. And what happens, it becomes impaired, and then they end up causing insulin resistance and leading into type 2 diabetes.
Do you have a problem with the way that the conventional medical world approaches the treatment of diabetes?
Well, in certain cases, I don't. But in the majority of cases, I do, because they don't correct the underlying cause of the problem. They're not changing the chemistry, they're not changing the physiology. What they're doing is they're giving you a drug to either suppress or support a gland or to balance out your blood sugar levels. But that's not going to correct the underlying cause of the problem. So, you know, sometimes people may need to be on medications to balance out their blood sugar levels, but I think what the real approach really needs to be is let's catch this in an earlier stage before they get into the pathological stage or the disease stage of such as diabetes, before they get there, so we can correct it and we won't even actually have to put them on a drug.
What can you do with diet or otherwise that's natural to lower blood sugar levels?
Well, the most important key is to eat every couple of hours. And most people can't fathom that. Well, if I eat every 2 hours, I'm going to gain weight. Well, that's just the opposite is true, because, see, when we eat a big meal and we don't eat, or people skip breakfast, our body says, wow, we don't know when that person's going to eat again, so we're going to store it all as fat. And so by eating every 2 hours, that's very good. Having protein with your meals. A lot of people get up and just eat carbohydrates. And the analogy I use is like protein is like a log, and then the sugars or simple carbohydrates are like little sticks on the fire. And if you're trying to heat a house, you can throw the little sticks on the fire. What happens? The fire goes up, it comes right back down. And that's what happens to your blood sugar when you eat simple carbohydrates or if you eat sugar. And so what happens if you throw a log on there, what happens is the blood glucose levels stay more stable, and you're not going to get all these symptoms, and you don't end up on this emotional roller coaster because someone gets up, they have their cup of coffee, they slam down some carbohydrates in the form of breads or muffins or something like that, of course with some jelly on there because there's more sugar in that, and then an hour and a half later they're all up, and then an hour and a half later the blood sugar levels drop, and what happens? They're not feeling well, and I need a pick-me-up, so what's going to be the pick-me-up? An instant sugar, so they take more sugar, and they end up on this vicious cycle throughout the day.
Let's take a look at a slide we have that talks about insulin resistance. It's 5B, and this is the connection between insulin resistance and cholesterol. Cholesterol. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we have to realize that if you look at the arrows over on the right-hand side, you can see that insulin resistance goes down into an enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase. And basically, the next step below that is cholesterol. So what happens is that when this enzyme HMG-CoA reductase is elevated, your cholesterol also goes up. So in conventional practice, what they do is they put you on a statin drug. And that statin drug, what it does is it down-regulates that HMG-CoA reductase. So if that one goes down, then your cholesterol is going to go down. But what happens is the underlying problem, which is up above, the insulin resistance, has not been corrected. So from a functional standpoint, we try to correct the insulin resistance, okay? And if we correct the insulin resistance, the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme goes down, and then your cholesterol levels go down automatically.
I was not aware that there was a connection between insulin resistance and cholesterol.
Yeah, well, most people aren't. But that's not the only thing that elevates your cholesterol. There are a host of other things that could elevate it, but I'm going to tell you, a lot of times by correcting the insulin resistance or blood sugar level, you'll actually see the cholesterol levels absolutely drop right out of the bottom.